It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in the middle of the busy city. The sky was gray, and water was pouring down on the streets, making the traffic move even slower than usual. People were running around with umbrellas, trying to stay dry, but one man didn't seem to mind the weather much. He stepped out of a simple ride-share car right in front of a very famous jewelry store called Eclat. This wasn't just any shop, it was the kind of place where the windows were made of thick glass, and everything inside sparkled under bright lights. Most people who walked into the store arrived in fancy cars or wore expensive suits, but this man was different. He stepped onto the wet pavement wearing a hoodie that looked like it had seen better days. It was a dark blue color, a bit loose, and definitely not made by any big fashion brand. On his legs, he wore a pair of old jeans that were slightly faded, and on his feet were boots that looked worn out and comfortable. He didn't have a bodyguard with him, and he wasn't holding an umbrella. He just pulled his hood up over his head to shield his face from the rain and kept his head down. To everyone rushing past him on the street, he looked completely invisible. He looked like just another guy trying to get through the day, perhaps tired from work or just looking for a place to hide from the storm. As he walked toward the glass doors of the shop, a young couple walked out. They were dressed up, holding a small fancy bag, and laughing about something. They barely glanced at the man in the hoodie as they passed him. To them, he was just part of the background noise of the city. He didn't look like he had thousands of dollars in his pocket. He didn't look like he belonged in a shop that sold diamond necklaces and gold watches. He looked quiet, humble, and ordinary. But this ordinary-looking man was actually Keanu Reeves, one of the most famous actors in the world. Yet, without a movie set around him or a red carpet under his feet, he moved through the world with a surprising lack of ego. He reached for the door handle, his hand looking rough and natural. There was no flash of cameras, no screaming fans, and no autograph requests. It was just a man opening a door. A small bell chimed above him as he stepped inside, signaling his arrival to the people working there. The air inside was cool and smelled like expensive perfume and polished wood. It was a world away from the wet, gritty street outside. Keanu shook his hood off slightly, but he still kept his head low. He wasn't there to show off. He wasn't there to be seen. He had a specific purpose, a kind thought in his mind that had brought him to this expensive place. He walked slowly through the store, his hands clasped behind his back in a relaxed way. He wasn't touching anything. He wasn't demanding attention. He was just looking. His eyes moved from one glass case to another, taking in the beauty of the items. He wasn't looking for something for himself, he was thinking about someone else. In his pocket, he had a wallet that could have bought the entire store, but on the outside, he looked like a man who might be counting his coins to buy a cup of coffee. This contrast between who he was and how he looked was the thing that would set the stage for what happened next. He was just a man in a hoodie, looking for a gift, unaware that he was walking into a judgment zone that would shock everyone involved. Once inside, the atmosphere of the shop felt heavy with silence and expensive smells. It was the kind of quiet where you felt like you had to whisper, even though no one told you to. Keanu walked slowly along the velvet-lined displays, his hands still tucked behind his back. He wasn't in a rush. He was looking at the items with genuine interest, studying the details of the craftsmanship. To him, the story behind the object mattered more than the price tag hanging on it. He stopped near a glass counter that held a collection of vintage watches. These weren't the flashy, diamond-encrusted ones that screamed for attention. These were classic, timeless pieces, the kind that lasted a lifetime. He leaned in slightly, his eyes focusing on a silver watch with a worn leather band. It reminded him of something, perhaps a memory or a style he knew his friend would appreciate. While he stood there, perfectly content and harmless, the staff members behind the counters began to notice him. And unfortunately, not in a good way. There were 3 employees working on the main floor. They were dressed in sharp black suits, with perfectly ironed shirts and shiny shoes. They moved around the floor like they were gliding, holding their heads high, looking for customers who looked like they belonged in a magazine. One of them, a tall man with gelled hair, looked over at Keanu. He saw the worn-out hoodie. He saw the scuffed boots. He saw the uncombed hair. In that split second, a judgment was made. The man didn't see a movie star, he saw someone who had probably wandered in off the street to escape the rain. The tall employee nudged his colleague, a woman standing near the register, and whispered something while looking in Keanu's direction. She looked over, covered her mouth to hide a small laugh, and then turned her back to continue arranging some necklaces in a display case. It was a rude gesture, but Keanu didn't see it. He was too busy looking at the watches, his mind focused on finding the right gift. He remained patient, waiting for someone to come over and ask if they could open the case. He assumed that was how shops worked. You walk in, you show interest, and people help you. But the help never came. Minutes ticked by. Another customer walked in, a woman dressed in a fur coat holding a designer purse. The moment she stepped through the door, it was like a switch had been flipped. The same employee who had ignored Keanu suddenly rushed over to her with a huge smile on his face. "Good afternoon, madam." "Welcome back," he said loudly, his voice echoing in the quiet store. He treated her like royalty, opening doors and nodding respectfully. It was a stark contrast to how they were treating Keanu. He watched this interaction from a few feet away, still standing by the watch counter. He didn't get angry. He didn't stomp his feet. He just observed it with a calm, almost sad look on his face. It was clear to him that he was being judged solely by his clothes. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to catch someone's eye. He cleared his throat softly, hoping it might signal that he was ready to buy something. But the staff had developed a sudden blindness. They were suddenly very busy doing nothing. They were cleaning glass that was already spotless. They were typing furiously on computers that were already on. They were doing everything they could to avoid making eye contact with the man in the hoodie. It was an uncomfortable situation, and the tension in the room was rising, even if only Keanu could feel it. The irony of the situation was painful. Keanu Reeves had enough money to buy everything in the store without making a dent in his bank account. Yet, because he chose to dress comfortably and live simply, he was treated like he didn't exist. He was used to being recognized, of course, but he was also used to moving through the world as a normal person. Usually, people are surprised to see him but are generally polite. This was different. This was a cold, calculated ignoring based on arrogance. The staff had decided he wasn't worth their time because he didn't look wealthy. He waited a bit longer, perhaps giving them one last chance to do their job. He looked back at the silver watch in the case. He really liked it. It had a simplicity to it that he admired. He imagined how happy his friend would be to receive it. But the joy of the potential purchase was being dampened by the rude service. He sighed very quietly, a sound that was lost in the air conditioning hum. He was a kind person by nature, someone who believes in the good of people, but even he had his limits. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He was just asking for basic human decency. And right now, in this fancy shop, that was exactly what he wasn't getting. He stood there alone, surrounded by luxury, feeling completely invisible, while the staff stood just feet away, pretending he wasn't there. The quietness of the shop wasn't peaceful anymore, it was filled with a silent judgment that was loud and clear. The situation on the sales floor was becoming more awkward by the minute, and it wasn't just Keanu who noticed it. From a glass-walled office at the back of the store, the manager was watching everything unfold. This man took his job very seriously. He believed that selling luxury items wasn't just about moving products, it was about maintaining an image. To him, the store was like a private club, and he was the bouncer who decided who got in and who stayed out. He stood with his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the floor like a hawk. He saw the well-dressed customers being served champagne and polite smiles. Then he saw the man in the hoodie, still standing by the vintage watches, still being ignored. But instead of wondering why his staff wasn't helping a potential customer, he felt annoyed that the stranger was still there. The manager decided to intervene. He straightened his suit jacket, checked his reflection in the window to make sure his hair was perfect, and marched out onto the floor. He didn't walk with the calm grace of a host, he walked with the heavy steps of someone about to handle a problem. His shoes clicked loudly on the marble floor, cutting through the quiet music. The other staff members saw him coming and quickly looked busy, but they knew exactly what he was doing. They watched with hidden smirks, expecting him to kick the intruder out. Keanu didn't hear the manager approach at first. He was still looking at the silver watch, his mind visualizing the moment he could give it to his friend. It was going to be a special moment, a surprise to show appreciation. He was thinking about the card he might write to go with it. He was pulled out of his thoughts when a large shadow fell over the glass case. He turned around slowly, expecting to finally be helped. Instead, he was met with a cold, unsmiling face. The manager didn't offer a hand to shake. He didn't ask how the day was going. He stood too close, invading Keanu's personal space, and looked him up and down with eyes full of judgment. The silence stretched out for a few seconds, making the air feel thick. Then, the manager broke the silence, but not with a welcome. His voice was loud, sharp, and carried clearly across the room. It was a voice meant to scold, not to serve. "Can I help you with something?" the manager asked, but his tone made it clear that helping was the last thing on his mind. It sounded more like, "What are you doing here?" Keanu, being the polite man he is, didn't get defensive. He smiled softly and pointed a gentle finger toward the watch in the case. "Yes, actually," Keanu replied in his quiet, respectful voice. "I was interested in this piece right here. I think it would be a perfect gift. Could you tell me a little more about it?" The manager looked at the watch, then back at Keanu, and let out a short, mocking laugh. It was a sound that made the other customers turn their heads. "That one?" the manager scoffed. "Sir, do you have any idea how much that watch costs? This is a high-end establishment. We don't sell casual watches here. These are collector's items." Keanu remained calm. He didn't flinch at the tone. "I understand," he said simply. "I'm happy to pay for it, I just wanted to see it up close." The manager's face grew harder. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked like they had just rolled out of bed. He decided it was time to escalate things. He wanted to make a scene, to make an example of this man so that others would know the dress code. He took another step forward, lowering his voice just enough so it was threatening, but still loud enough for the staff to hear. "Look," the manager said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I'm going to be honest with you. You don't look like you belong in this store. We have a certain clientele here. People who dress appropriately. People who can afford these things. He gestured vaguely at Keanu's hoodie. You're blocking the view for our real customers. If you're looking for a souvenir or a cheap gift, there's a souvenir shop 2 blocks down. They have keychains and t-shirts that are more in your price range. It was a cruel thing to say. The words hung in the air, heavy and insulting. The manager crossed his arms, a smug smile playing on his lips, waiting for Keanu to wither under the embarrassment. He expected the man to apologize, to look down at his feet, and to scurry out the door with his tail between his legs. He expected victory. But Keanu didn't move. He didn't look down. He just looked at the manager with a steady, calm gaze. He didn't shout back. He didn't pull out a black card to wave in the man's face. He just stood there, grounded and dignified. He was confused by the hatred coming from a complete stranger, but he wasn't going to let it ruin his day. He was about to open his mouth to speak, to perhaps ask why the man was being so unkind, but the manager wasn't done yet. He was enjoying his moment of power too much to stop now. I'm asking you to leave, the manager added, pointing a finger toward the exit. Unless you are going to buy something right now, I suggest you go. You're making the customers uncomfortable. The irony was lost on the manager. He was the only one making anyone uncomfortable. The other shoppers were looking over with wide eyes, whispering to each other about the rudeness of the staff. Keanu took a deep breath. He realized that no amount of explaining would fix this. The manager had made up his mind based on a hoodie. It was a sad reminder of how shallow the world could be, but it wasn't a reflection of Keanu's worth. He prepared to respond, not with anger, but with a quiet truth that would soon change everything. The manager stood there with his chest puffed out, feeling very proud of himself. He thought he had done a great job protecting his store from someone who didn't belong. In his mind, he was the hero of the story, keeping the luxury shop pure for the right kind of people. He looked down at Keanu with a smug grin, expecting to see the man's face turn red with shame. He expected Keanu to mumble an apology, put his head down, and hurry out the door into the rain, but that is not what happened at all. Keanu didn't look ashamed. He didn't look angry, either. He just looked calm. He stood his ground with a quiet dignity that made the manager's arrogance look silly. Keanu looked the manager right in the eye. His expression was sad but serious. He didn't shout or raise his voice. He spoke in a soft, level tone. I am actually here to buy a gift, Keanu said gently. I have the money to pay for it. I just wanted to see the watch. I don't understand why you are being so unkind to me. The manager let out a loud, sharp laugh, tossing his head back as if he had just heard the funniest joke in the world. He wanted everyone in the store to hear him. He wanted to humiliate Keanu even more. Money, the manager sneered, his voice echoing off the walls. You look at you. You're wearing a dirty hoodie and old boots. You honestly expect me to believe you can afford a vintage watch here? Come on. Stop wasting my time. You're probably just looking for something to steal. Get out before I call the security guards. It was a terrible accusation. The other customers in the shop stopped what they were doing. The air in the room froze. A woman who had been trying on a ring paused, her hand in mid-air. A man browsing near the door looked over with a frown. Even the staff members stopped their fake cleaning and looked nervous. Calling a customer a thief was a line that shouldn't be crossed, especially when the customer hadn't done anything wrong. But the manager was too blinded by his own ego to see how bad he looked. Just as the manager opened his mouth to say something even ruder, A gasp came from the back of the store. It was a loud, sharp sound of pure shock. Everyone turned their heads to see where it came from. Standing near the necklace display was a wealthy-looking woman. She was wearing a very expensive coat and had been browsing quietly for the last 10 minutes. She was staring at Keanu, her eyes wide as saucers and her mouth hanging open. She looked like she had seen a ghost. Her expensive handbag slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a heavy thud, but she didn't even care. She took a few steps closer, squinting her eyes as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. She looked from the man in the hoodie to the angry manager, and then back to the man. Her face went from pale to bright red with excitement. "Oh my God," she whispered, but the silence in the room was so deep that everyone heard her. She took another step forward, her voice trembling. That is Keanu Reeves?" The name hung in the air like magic dust. For a second, nobody moved. The manager blinked, his face scrunching up in confusion. "Keanu who?" he asked, sounding annoyed that the woman was interrupting his power trip. "Keanu Reeves?" The woman nearly shouted this time. She pulled her phone out of her pocket, though she didn't even take a picture. She just pointed it at him like a weapon. "The actor. The Matrix, John Wick. Are you serious? You are kicking Keanu Reeves out of your store?" The effect on the room was instant. It was like someone had flipped a switch. The other customers gasped. A young man near the door grabbed his friend's arm and squeezed it tight. "No way," he whispered. "That really is him." The staff members froze. Their faces went from smug to terrified in the blink of an eye. The sales associate who had laughed earlier turned pale as a sheet. She dropped the cloth she was holding. They all realized, at the exact same moment, that they had made a massive, terrible mistake. The manager, however, was still stuck in his arrogance for a few more seconds. He looked at Keanu, then at the woman, and let out a nervous chuckle. "Ma'am, please," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "This is not Keanu Reeves? Why would a movie star be in here dressed like this? This is just a guy looking for trouble." But the woman was having none of it. "I have seen every single one of his movies," she said, her voice full of anger now. "I know his face. That is him. And you are treating him like dirt because he is wearing comfortable clothes. You should be ashamed of yourself." Suddenly, the store didn't feel so exclusive anymore. It felt like a courtroom, and the manager was on trial. The other customers started muttering in agreement. "Yeah, that looks just like him," one person said. "I can't believe the manager just called him a thief," another whispered harshly. The mood of the entire shop had shifted completely. The power was no longer in the manager's hands. He looked around at the angry faces of his real customers and realized he was in deep trouble. He turned back to look at Keanu, really looking at him for the first time. He saw the kindness in the actor's eyes, the familiar shape of his face, and the calm way he handled the stress. The blood drained from the manager's face. His legs felt weak. He realized the woman was right. He hadn't just been rude to a random person, he had insulted, accused, and tried to kick out one of the most famous and respected actors in the entire world. And he had done it right in front of witnesses. The silence that returned to the room was no longer peaceful, it was absolutely suffocating. The realization hit the manager like a ton of bricks. His face turned a deep shade of red, and then quickly went pale as a ghost. The confident, arrogant posture he had just seconds ago completely collapsed. He looked at Keanu, really looked at him, and suddenly the features clicked into place. The nose, the eyes, the quiet demeanor, it was undeniable. The man he had just insulted, called a thief, and threatened to kick out was actually a global superstar. The man who could buy the entire chain of stores without blinking. Panic set in immediately. The manager's hands started shaking, and his knees felt weak. He glanced around the room and saw that everyone was staring at him. The wealthy woman who had recognized Keanu was shaking her head in disappointment. The other customers were whispering, not in awe of the celebrity, but in disgust at the manager's behavior. Even his own staff were looking at the floor, wishing they could disappear. The manager knew he had messed up, and he knew he had to fix it, or his career might be over. I. The manager stuttered, his voice cracking. He took a step closer to Keanu, but this time he wasn't invading space, he was practically cowering. "Mr. Reeves? Sir. I had no idea. I am so sorry. Please, forgive me." He was bowing his head slightly, his tone shifting from demanding to begging in a heartbeat. It was a pathetic sight to see. Just moments ago, he was acting like the king of the castle, and now he was scrambling for mercy. Keanu stood there, listening to the apology, but his face didn't change. He didn't look angry, and he didn't look flattered. He just looked tired. He watched the manager perform his act of remorse. It was clear that the manager wasn't sorry because he had been rude to a human being, he was sorry because that human being was famous. If Keanu were just a regular guy, the manager would still be kicking him out. That hypocrisy was what made the situation so ugly. The manager, sensing that Keanu wasn't melting under his apology, started to panic even more. He started talking faster, tripping over his own words. "Please, let me make it up to you," he insisted. He snapped his fingers at his staff, who jumped like scared rabbits. "Open the case. Get the watch out. Get the champagne. Mr. Reeves, please, whatever you want, it is on the house. Consider it a gift. No, take anything you want. Please, just give me a chance to fix this." The staff scrambled to obey. One of them rushed to the back, likely to fetch the most expensive bottle of wine they had. Another quickly unlocked the glass case that held the vintage watches, pulling out the silver one Keanu had been looking at earlier. They held it out to him like a peace offering, their hands trembling. The store had turned from a place of judgment into a place of desperate begging. It was uncomfortable to watch. They weren't treating him with respect because they realized he was a good person, they were treating him with respect because they were terrified of his power and fame. Keanu looked at the watch in the salesperson's hand. It was a beautiful piece, just as he had thought. But suddenly, the magic was gone. The joy of buying a gift for a friend was tainted by the ugliness he had just experienced. He didn't want to give his friend something that came from a place filled with such shallow judgment. He didn't want to support a business that treated people poorly based on how they dressed. He took a deep breath and looked the manager in the eye. The room went completely silent. Everyone wanted to know what the movie star would do. Would he yell? Would he buy the store just to fire them? Keanu reached out and gently pushed the watch away, shaking his head slowly. "No, thank you," Keanu said softly. His voice was calm, but it carried a heavy weight that silenced the manager's stuttering. "I appreciate the offer, really. But I'm not going to buy anything today." The manager's jaw dropped. But sir, please. It's free. I insist." "It's not about the money," Keanu said, cutting him off gently. He looked around the room, making eye contact with the staff and the other customers. "I came in here hoping to buy something nice for a friend. I came in here ready to spend money. But you didn't see a customer. You saw a hoodie. You decided I wasn't good enough to be in your store. You judged me by my cover, and you were wrong. The manager opened his mouth to speak, but Keanu raised a hand to stop him. I'm not upset for myself, Keanu continued. I can handle it. But what if I wasn't me? What if I was just a guy who saved up his money for a year to buy a gift for his wife? You would have made him feel small. You would have ruined his day, too. That's not right. People deserve to be treated with kindness, no matter what they wear. The words hung in the air. The manager stood frozen, completely speechless. There was nothing he could say to that. He knew Keanu was right. He had been caught in his own shallow game, and there was no way out. Keanu turned to the woman who had recognized him. He gave her a small, genuine smile and nodded his head. Thank you, he said to her. Have a good day. Then, without another word to the manager or the staff, Keanu turned around. He pulled his hood back up over his head, shielding his face once again. He walked toward the glass doors the same way he had entered, quietly and humbly. The bell chimed as he pushed the door open, and he stepped back out into the rainy afternoon. Inside the store, the silence was deafening. The manager stood there, surrounded by luxury watches and expensive jewelry, but he felt like he had lost everything valuable. The customers watched through the window as Keanu walked down the street, disappearing into the city. The staff looked at their boss, waiting for orders, but he just stared at the door, realizing that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had chased away a legend, all because he couldn't see past a hoodie. It was a lesson in humility that he would never forget, taught to him by the kindest man in Hollywood.